Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be looking at the Candidates Tournament. We're in round 6 of the Candidates Tournament. This is a 14-round tournament, and the winner of this will go on to face Magnus Carlsen early next year for the World Championship. Our competitors today, White's going to be played by Alireza, one of the favorites in this tournament, the definitely person that Magnus Carlsen wants to face for the World Championship. And Black's going to be played by Fabiano Caruana, who has won this tournament in the past. Now, they're definitely having different tournaments so far. Fabiano is in second place, only a half a game behind Jan Nepo, who won it last time. And Alireza, although he is, in many minds, the favorite for this tournament, he is in last place. But that can be somewhat deceiving. He's only 1 point behind Fabiano, who's in second. If Alireza with the white pieces wins today, he'll actually be tied with Fabiano. So while we're only in round 6, this starts to mean a lot to these players. So let's go ahead and get started with Alireza and the white pieces. Starts out with d4, knight f6 from Fabiano, c4, then e6, g3, getting into the Catalan opening with bishop g2. And then we have bishop e7. Now, this is the closed Catalan. You have the open if the pawn takes on c4, but Fabiano decides to go for the closed variation with bishop e7. Now we have knight f3, castle on the king's side, and White responds with queen d3. I thought this was pretty interesting because the main lines you typically see, pawn takes d5, castle on the king's side, get king safety, or just knight c3. But decides to go ahead and get his queen involved into the game with queen d3. Pawn c5, there is going to be an exchange after the castle on the d4 square. Then after knight c6, we see the knights come off the board as well. And then knight to d5, it's a nice little outpost. Both sides have one central pawn on the e file. The c and the d file are open up, so you will start to see both sides getting their rooks involved into the game, trying to control these long open files. Rook to d1, so Alireza starts that with getting his rook to the d file. Bishop f6, attacking the queen. Queen comes over here, g4. Could have played more of a passive move, but hey, decides if I get my queen involved into the game, I want to keep it engaged. So queen g4 still attacks the king side of the board here. Bishop d7, getting the bishop involved. Also just opening up for the rook to come to c8, controlling that c file as we talked about. Knight to d2, needs to get both the rooks involved into the game. So first needs to get his knight involved and then eventually his bishop as well. Queen e7, knight f3, rook to c8 as we predicted, and then pawn e4. And I thought this was a pretty crucial move because my initial thought did not see how Fabiano could get out of this because knight really needs to move out of the way. Can't come to f4. This is just going to die to the pawn here. But if it comes to, c7, it's pretty awkward with the move e5, attacking the bishop. Where does the bishop move? Can't just take here. It's defended by the knight. And if it comes to either g5 or h4, it is going to fall to the knight that's protected by the queen. But Fabiano correctly found the move e5, and that stops it. And you may say, well, yeah, you just take the knight here. Yes, but this is a discovered attack with the bishop attacking the queen. So Alireza is forced to move the queen. Queen h5. Now after knight to b4, since it is still under attack by the pawn, we see bishop to g5 attacking the queen. Bishop takes, knight comes to g5. Now we do have a mate threat. Queen takes on h7 would be checkmate. Fabiano can't let that happen. So h6, now the knight comes back to f3. Knight c6, just positioning a little bit better. It wasn't doing much on the b4 square, so comes back to c6. And if it wants to eventually come back to d4, it has that option with a new outpost. Remember, before it was on the d5 square, but since the pawn's moved, the outpost has changed as well. And this is where things get spicy. So this bishop on d7, Alireza says, you know what? I'm in last place. It's time to shock the world and let people know that I came to play. Decides to sacrifice his rook and take the bishop on d7. After the queen takes, we do have bishop h3, so able to get back some material. This is attacking the queen and behind it the rook. Fabiano does have the move pawn f5 to stop it, so it does allow him to get a pawn in material. but he is still down a pawn in the exchange. If you think about a bishop being worth 3 points and a pawn being worth 1 point, he did give up 5 points from the rook, so he is down. Curious to see how he uses this with his game plan. Rook to e8. So Fabiano is now in the game plan of just hold the fort, do not lose to whatever shenanigans Alireza is trying to play, and he should do well in the endgame. Knight to h4, pawn e4, just pushing that a little bit more. Rook to d1, finally getting that rook involved into the game. Queen over 2 f7 says, hey, if you want to trade off, that's going to be good for me. Anytime you're up in material, you want to trade off as much material as possible. Alireza recognizes that is not going to be the game plan that wins for him. So queen back to e2. And then Fabiano gobbles up more material here on a2. So now he's only down, or has now exchanged the bishop for his opponent's rook. Alireza will be looking to get some of that material back. You can see it's kind of difficult. Like, how does he continue in this setup? I'm curious what he was thinking when he gave up that rook, but we'll see how play continues. Knight to g6, attacking the rook, rook f7. Knight comes back to f4, queen to b3, bishop to g4 here, and then pawn down e3. King g2, and if you look at it and say, why does the king need to come to g2? One of the threats that white had after playing bishop g4 is the move bishop h5. It pins down the rook on f7 to the other rook. It looks like he can gobble up one of these rooks. So that's the whole reason he played bishop to g4. But he can't do that right away because of the move pawn takes on f2 check. Now after the queen takes here, then the rook can come down to f5, and this rook's actually protected. The bishop can't take it because now the queen can just come down, take the rook on d1, check, and white is going to lose. So while it looks immediately like, yeah, well, the queen and the bishop are both protecting this rook, that would actually be a mistake to think that. And so the king comes to g2 for safety and recognizing that he just can't play bishop h5 right away. So now Fabiano decides to go ahead and play rook to d8. Does not want to have to worry about the bishop coming to h5, and also completely fine just exchanging material. Remember, he's up in material, so exchanging down is going to be a good thing. Rook takes on d8, knight takes, and then the pawn takes on e3. Rook over to c7. So Alireza was able to get one pawn back, but he still is down to material from he's given up a rook and he's gotten a bishop and pawn in exchange. King comes to h3, knight to f7 here. Bishop f3 attacking the rook. The rook comes down to c2 attacking the queen, and then queen down to d1. Now knight to g5, and this is extremely important because if not knight to g5, maybe if you look at it and say, well, why didn't he just capture material on b2? Well, this would be a mistake because queen d7, and this kind of even things up. Let's say we now have knight takes g5. Remember, black used one of his moves to come over and capture the pawn on b2. Well, now this is just going to be a drawn game because after king g4, then maybe the knight comes down f3, but there's just going to be an ongoing series of checks. Now, if the queen comes to g8 to stop it, doesn't really matter. Knight to g6, and just going to be checking all game long. So Fabiano does have to be careful that he does not have a perpetual check because he's currently winning, does not want to end up drawing the game. So after the queen comes to d1, instead of taking the pawn on b2, he knows he can get that material at any point, but he needs to keep the pressure up. So knight to g5 check, and then after the king to g4, now decides to play knight to f3. Now queen d8 as we talked about, but it's a little bit different than before because after king to h7, this queen on d8 can't come to the critical square of g6. Remember before it came to d7 and then it came to e8, which allowed it to come to g6. It can't do that because it's currently on the d8 square. So white first takes the knight on f3, but then black takes the pawn on b2. And it's very difficult to see how white's going to continue and get a victory out of this position. Fabiano now decides to play rook to d8. Does not want his rooks to be on the same diagonal, being attacked by the bishop here. Also decides, hey, yeah, if you want to exchange some material from your rook, that's fine with me. I'm up in material. This is going to be good. White decides to go ahead and exchange. Knight comes back to d8. The only good thing for white, although you don't want to trade down, is now the knight is not very active at all. It has going to take a few moves for the knight to get back in the action. Maybe Alireza is looking to pounce on that. First decides to go ahead and take the pawn on e3. So does get a pawn back in material. He's now traded off a rook for a bishop and a pawn. But it is still difficult to turn that into an advantage. Rook to c7, king h3, knight f7, and then after bishop to f3, then you see the rook come down to c2, attacking the queen. The queen comes down to d1, and then we see the move knight to g5. And this is an important move because a lot of players may make the mistake of, yeah, I can just play knight g5, but that's check and my opponent can move their king. So I'll just go ahead and take this material on b2. Just gobble up as much material as possible. Unfortunately, if black does not keep up the pressure with check, then this could very easily end up in a drawn game. Queen to d7. And this is an even game. If you run it through the engine and see who's winning, it says that both sides are equal. And part of the reason for that is it's very easy for white to have a perpetual check here. Maybe now knight to to g5 check. Okay, well now just king to g4. And then after the knight coming down to f3, you have queen e8, and this is perpetual check. There's no way to get out of it. Yes, they could eventually bring their queen into the game, but then after knight to g6, there's no way to really stop the checks from going back and forth. So Fabiano has to be aware of that and says, you know what, I'm not going to fall for that mistake. Instead of playing rook takes on b2, I am just going to keep up the pressure with knight to g5 check. So king g4, knight comes down, takes the bishop on f3. Now we have queen to d8, king to h7, and this is very different. Before, the queen came to d7, and then it came to queen to e8, and it could easily come to g6, and that would be the perpetual check that we talked about. On d8, it is a little bit trickier because it is going to take a few moves. So first, the king is going to take the knight on f3. Queen now takes on b2, capturing that pawn that Fabiano knew he could take at any time. And now queen e8. Now this is preparing for the move queen g6, as we talked about. Fabiano has to block that, so he plays queen f6. But you can start to see from White's standpoint, really difficult to see how he's going to continue and get a victory out of this. Very ambitious to give up the rook without, in my opinion, a clear path to an attack. Definitely opened things up and made it interesting, but now we're at a point where Fabiano defended correctly, and it just seems tough for White to continue in the spot. Does play pawn e4, rook over to h2, gobbling up that pawn in material. So now Fabiano getting more of a material advantage here. Queen down to d7, queen c3, attacking the king, king g4, and then after queen d2, we have queen a4. Now Alireza decided to resign in this position. Many times people ask, well, how would play continue? Why did he resign? Well, first and foremost, h5 is probably the deadly move that Fabiano would play if play continued. This is check. How do you really continue from here? If you take with your knight, it's very difficult to hold on to that knight because now the queen and the rook are both attacking together. This is check. Maybe you could play rook to f2 in this spot. Eventually, you are going to gobble up that knight in material. So just not going to end well. So decides, you know what? I'm playing Fabiano. He's probably not going to make that mistake. So after the move queen to a4, decides to go ahead and resign in this spot. So Fabiano, congratulations to him. Still in second place, only a half game behind Jan-Eppo because Jan-Eppo also won his game against JKD. So that was a fascinating game as well. I've been really excited about this particular matchup because so many people were hyped about Alireza, myself included. Disappointed to see he is still in last place with only 2 points. We'll need a strong run over the next 8 rounds if anyone can do it, you can see he's an exciting player, always willing to take chances, but definitely in a tough spot right now. Hopefully you guys enjoy this coverage of round 6 in the 2022 Candidates Tournament. Let me know if you have feedback on any matchups you want to make sure that I cover in this tournament, or just any other feedback in general. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.